Hello, welcome to another video here. Today I'm going to be taking a look at combat in D&D 5th edition. This is something that it's been approached a few times in different videos. I think I talked about it in my how to deal with a big party episode. I think I've even talked about it in maybe some of my metagaming, DM talk, stuff like that. And so I just decided that, you know what, I got some downtime here this morning. Why not just kind of pump out a little bit of a video here to just kind of solidify, put into one place my thoughts when it comes to combat here in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So, not going to be too long, not too many slides to show. It's going to be more talking today. So, in terms of strengths, I don't want to, for how much I'm about to disrespect 5th edition's combat, I do want to give it some credit here, and that is that there are some strengths here, especially when you compare, say, 5th edition's combat to other editions' combat. 5th edition, it can be done quickly. There's not that many rolls that need to be made, which if you are someone who has played 4th edition, if you're someone who's played even some previous 3rd editions, then you know that there used to be a lot of numbers that used to have to be included every time someone was asking, you know, what's my bonus to hit? The fact that Wizards of the Coast basically came out in 5th edition and said, they introduced the advantage-disadvantage system and said that all of those rolls are just going to come down to advantage and disadvantage, and no matter how many advantages you have, if you have a disadvantage, then they cancel out. And we're not going to deal with it. We're not going to sit there and compare apples to oranges. We're not going to sit here and go, well, the sun's to your back, but they're up a hill, and you're fighting with a bow and arrow, but their shield isn't big enough to deflect them. So I'm glad that they removed all of that shit. So it is entirely possible to have a 5th edition combat go relatively quickly when done correctly, which we will talk about here today. Streamlined. It's very nice. A lot of classes are very cut dry. Here's your list of spells. Here's your list of actions. Here's what you get to do. You have your big action, your bonus action, and your movement. And that's it. Go do the thing, and I feel like Wizards of the Coast did a very good job of outlining a lot of their abilities. I think for the most part, everything feels very fluid. Everything feels very, like it makes sense that this thing would take me an action to do. It would make sense that this thing takes a bonus action to do. And so I feel that overall it can be very streamlined. Now I will put a little connotation there and say that, a little annotation there and say that it is streamlined up until you reach certain levels. I think if anyone has ever been in a level 20 one-shot battle royale, then you have realized very quickly that this is not true. That eventually, once the wizard has the ability to cast every single spell in their arsenal, as soon as you have a fighter who can attack, 15 times in one turn, and as soon as you start including like all the crazy magic items in there, then things can get clunky very, very quickly. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But for the most part, if we're looking at just bare bones, it is actually very streamlined. It's just how do we get back to that streamline no matter what level the players are, which is going to be a couple of tips here today. And characters feel unique. I feel very much that if I play a warlock character, then I feel like I am a warlock character versus when I play a fighter character versus when I play a cleric character. I like that. I think we've all played a video game at some point probably, or a board game maybe, or some other RPG game where it doesn't really matter what class you play, because in the end, you're going to feel the same, right? It doesn't matter how many times you restart Skyrim, you always end up being a stealth archer. Something like that. As soon as your sneak gets up there, then it doesn't matter what, if you were a spellcaster when you started, congratulations, you're picking up a bow and you're going assassin now. It doesn't feel that way with D&D. I think D&D does a very good job of having some very cool classes that feel very unique to each other. So overall, I think that all of these things come in and they bring a lot of good strengths here to D&D 5th edition. But let's stop giving them all the goods and let's start talking about the bads. It can become slow. I know I just said that 5th edition can be quick, but if you're watching this video, odds are you're watching this video because you are noticing that your combat is taking a while and you want some tips to make it go faster, which means you admit that it can become very, very slow. And I think we all can agree. There comes a point where, just due to players' choices, due to multiple things, which we'll talk about, that D&D, the combat scenarios they can feel so bogged down. You know, how is it that a fight that was supposed to just be the introduction here, you know, the party runs across a couple of wolves out in the forest. How is it that turns into a 55-minute slog fest, right? So stuff like that. So it can definitely become slow. It can definitely become clunky and mismatched, which just means that, you know, you can end up in a situation where, you know, you had this idea, you thought that it was going to be super streamlined, you thought that, okay, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and then the party's either going to win or they're going to run away. And then it doesn't, and party members end up picking things or doing things that just make you go, like, okay, you can try that, but, you know in the back of your head that, you know, you trying that isn't going to do anything. You're going to end up right in the same situation. But now we're having this conversation of whether or not I'm going to allow you to do this, which is eating up time, and I already know it's not going to make any difference. Things like that. You know, we've all, any DM who's watching this video, which probably not too many of you, but anyone who watches the video, if you've DM'd before, then you know that, you know, you've had that conversation with a player in which you know that what they're asking to do isn't going to do a damn thing, but you're trying to honor the player's choice. So if the player wants to do it, you don't want to tell them, don't worry, like, don't bother, don't waste your time, because it's not going to do what you think it's going to do. But at the same time, you know that, and so you're trying to have this conversation, and it's eating up time, and in the end, you know, it's just going to waste their turn. Stuff like that. Number 3, I find that monsters can feel like just giant bag of hit points. All right, you know, we've all been there, right? You've had your monster on one side of the battle map, the players are on the other, and you just take turns. Players go, you go. Players go, you go. And it feels like, okay, like, eventually one of these times the hit points are going to drop. Is it going to be on my monster? Or is it going to be on the players? Let's find out. And that just gets very boring. Which brings me to number 4, stagnance. You know, a battle map can feel very stagnant. It feels very common that, you know, once the enemy closes the distance, or once the players close the distance, that then they just stand there, right? The player, you know, the enemy the players, paladins and barbarians, they take their turn walloping, and then the big bad takes their turn walloping, and then the spellcaster in the back casts a distance spell or a healing spell on the party, and then the big bruisers take their turns walloping, then your enemy wallops, and then the spellcaster healer heals or casts a distance spell, and it just keeps going. And you find that, you know, turn 4 feels exactly the same way that turn 3 did. You know, no one really changed anything. Nothing really changed or happened, which is just kind of 5e. And that's, if you don't change anything, if all you do is just go in with the inclination of having that style, then that's very common here for a 5e battle. And battle maps can feel very two-dimensional. A little two-dimensional. See what I did there? But yeah, it kind of, you know, it goes back to the stagnant stuff. It's so easy to just have an enemy, the players surround the enemy, and then they just take turns walloping each other, and nothing really changes, which is what we're going to get here to fixing. So I feel like these are the big weaknesses. These are probably the things that you have noticed, you have felt. So let's go about trying to fix these weaknesses here. All right, so fixes. These are my top 6, and they're obviously not all of them, but I like to try to keep my list pretty short, because I don't want to have, you know, videos go for an hour and a half, or give you too many words to look at if you are watching this on YouTube. Fixes. Number 1, implement at least a 2-stage combat as often as you can. One of the best ways to change up, to break the boredom, the monotony of a combat, is to have a 2-stage combat as often as possible. Now, that doesn't mean that it has to happen every single combat, but if you can somehow have a moment in your mind that goes, okay, once 3 out of the 6 wolves have been killed, then this happens. once the enemy, the big bad, has reached half hit points, then this happens. Once the players have figured out that they need to, do this, once they get halfway done doing that thing, then this happens. Whatever the case is, have at least a 2-stage combat as often as you can. If any big D&D fan recognizes the photo up there on the top right, my good old knight from Dark Souls 3, that's the inspiration from this. And if you think about it, like Dark Souls games, a lot of these Dark Souls games, right, they are all basically just you versus a giant bag of hit points, and yet so many of those fights feel unique, so many of those fights feel awesome. Not many of especially looking at like Elden Ring, Dark Souls 3, a lot of these fights, they feel, these epic combats that if you really put it in very basic bare bones talk, it's literally just one giant bag of hit points that will kill you in 3 hits if you don't get out of the way. And yet that's not how you feel. So many of these games feel unique and feel awesome. And I think one of the things, and so, the point is, what can we take away from, Dark Souls combat and try to implement it more into our D&D games? And I think one of them is having multiple stage combat. So just to kind of give you a couple of ideas here, and I'm just going to spitball them nice and quick just so that we're not spending a lot of time on each one. But to do the big boss, all right, bosses are pretty easy. All right, have something, because it's entirely creative up to you. What do you want the big bad to do? So maybe, when the big boss reaches his halfway HP, then he immediately gets to take a turn. You don't wait for, you break initiative. I don't understand why in 5th edition we have this obsession with initiative. Initiative is just a way for the players to figure out who is going first, second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever. Don't be afraid to break initiative, especially if, you're noticing that, hey, by the time it gets back to my big boss, then the big boss is going to be dead. And this really cool moment is going to be broken because of it. So don't be afraid, break initiative and have, when the big boss reaches half hit points, then something epic changes. I'm thinking of, like, say, Elden Ring, right? The very iconic moment where, what's his name? Godric. Godric the Grafted, right? When he gets to a certain hit point level, what does he do? He fucking lobs off his own arm, shoves it into the head. Big plot, spoiler, by the way, if you haven't played Elden Ring yet, I guess. Shoves his fucking forearm into a dragon's head, a wyvern's head, and then now the fight continues with now him using a goddamn dragon head as a weapon. Like, that's epic and it's memorable, and so many people look at that moment and are like, that was a fucking epic fight. Do something similar. Have a moment where if the players get the enemy to a certain point, that you cause a drastic change. Don't just heal. Don't you dare just go, oh, he casts a heal on himself, he heals back to full HP. Like, don't do that, because now you're just continuing this cycle of big bag of hit points must keep smacking until bag of hit points is empty. Like, don't do that. Have something cool, have something epic. Make it, and be descriptive. I know I'm kind of jumping down to number 5, but, make sure that you're using epic descriptions when you're talking about these stages changing. That way you draw the player's attention to, like, hey, notice how this fight has just changed. So maybe the big boss, sprouts extra pairs of arms because they're grafted. They're a giant, flesh golem. And they've been hiding these multiple limbs in their body because it causes them damage, which is totally optional if you want, for your monster to take it or not. And so these extra limbs pop out, and each one has a weapon now. And so now, if an enemy stays within 5 feet of them at the end of their turn, they take damage because, one of these free hands gets just to attack them for free. Stuff like that. Just make it epic. Make it so that there is a definitive moment when the combat changed. If we're looking at something much smaller scale, like, say, to go back to the wolves, have it so it's like, okay, my 5-man party of level 3 players, they're coming up against 5 wolves, 6 wolves, whatever. Maybe when, 3 of the 6 wolves die, then maybe one of the wolves reveals itself to be a little bit more powerful than the others. Maybe it's a winter wolf or a forest spirit wolf. And so it goes over and it devours in a split second the body of one of its of the wolf brethren, and it sprouts the second wolf's head, and now it gets to bite multiple times. Now it has advantage on attacks naturally by itself because it's technically two wolves in one. If you're trying to not go so mythical, if you're like, but these are just meant to be fucking wolves, okay, then maybe you make it so that the 3 wolves, after the 3 out of the 5 or 6 wolves die, maybe the 3 other wolves just take off. They take the dash action and they get the fuck out because they hear something. And you describe to the players as you hear a monstrous growl barreling through the forest, because apparently the players engaging with these wolves has notified a very large, burly, grizzly forest creature in the nearby wood that blood has been spilled and it is hungry. And so then you just basically, you come up with a monster that, in this case, obviously, I'm looking at like a cave bear, something whose CR would equivalent to be about, 3-4 wolves. And then throw that in there. At the end of the day, the CR is about the same, but you've changed the combat into something different. Just stuff like that, all right? Try to implement a 2-stage combat as often as possible. Now, if it doesn't make sense for there to be a 2-stage combat, then it's okay. But try as often as you can to have a moment where the combat changed. That will get the players' attention every time. All right, fix number 2. Change the battlefield as often as possible, at least once. Make it so that trees fall when it's out in the forest. Make it so that, when the boss swings his giant mace or something and cracks the floor, make rough terrain. Change the battlefield as much as you possibly can. Try to include 3-dimensional space in it. Have things, on the ceiling. Try to include things flying around up in the air, or underground. Try to, make the battle map feel less like just a 2D printout and more like a living, breathing space that they are standing in, fighting in. So have columns that come crashing down. Have a ceiling that can be pulled, maybe by the enemy or by the party if they think that it will help them. Stuff like that. Just try to change the battlefield as often as you can. I look back, to go back to the Dark Souls series. Think of how many cool epic fights that they had in which the battlefield was one of the things that got changed, and it's what made it more epic. So, and you can combine these two. Maybe you have a change of a battlefield the same time that the big boss, whatever, enters their second phase. And now you have basically an entirely different combat scenario than the party was originally just slogging through. So change the battlefield as often as possible. Include rough terrain, include water hazards, include fire, and whatever you can to make it interesting. Change it up. That way, force the party to have to keep thinking on their feet. The moment that they know they can just move their token next to your big bad and just start swinging and never move, you've created boredom. All right, number 3. I can't talk today. Never have one enemy ever. This is 100% true, I think, in every single situation. I don't care if you have Orcus as your big bad. I don't care if you have a Demogorgon. I don't care if you have a Beholder. There is no reason for you to ever have one single enemy fighting your party. And there's a couple of reasons why you need to never do this. Number 1, it stops that feel of this being just a giant slugfest between your party and your big bad. Which, when you have only one enemy, that is the feel that will emerge when your party only has one thing that it needs to worry about. Then it just becomes this giant, all right, let's just surround him, start swinging, and not care about anything else. The moment you include another enemy, especially an enemy that can kind of go against the grain of the big bad. So if the big bad is a spellcaster, have a big, beefy, burly tank that can just, that casts no spells at all, but just hits like a fucking truck. Have something that's very different than the main monster, whatever it is. You know, whatever you can do, try to implement as often as you can, whether it's, you know, instead of one big wolf, you include 3 smaller wolves. Whether instead of one big bear, you have, you know, a bear and something that would, you know, follow around the bear and would attack its enemies, because it also knows that, you know, the bear, you know, whatever the bear kills, it gets to take some of. You know, whatever it is, try to include as often as you can multiple enemies. This gives players options. It allows players to have to think more critically, you know, which enemy do we deal with? Do we deal with the small one or the big one? You know, just things like that. So just never have one enemy by themselves. Always, always, always. Screw the CR system. We all know it sucks anyway. Always have multiple enemies. And if that means coming in waves, maybe that becomes part of the 2-stage combat. Is halfway through, they summon something, and that something helps them. Whatever the case, never have one enemy. Number 4, include in-combat talk from the enemies. Have them goad and you know, try to intimidate and disrupt combat. Have them, you know, talk, you know, and just give absolute shit to the party mid-combat. You know, I think some of the biggest, you know, I think back to, because again, I like to use video games as references. I think to something like, say, Borderlands, you know, the Borderlands series. Think of a lot of those super awesome combats that started because of some funny cutscene or some really badass cutscene with a really badass phrase said right at the beginning. Looking at you, Captain Flint from Borderlands 2. You know, have them talk and do things in the middle of combat. You know, have it so that, you know, when the enemy, you know, don't just say that, oh, the enemy comes up and tries to grapple you, and okay, now you're grappled, you're considered restrained until you break out. Tell them, get descriptive, which is, well, I'm going right into number 5 as well here. You know, get descriptive. Explain how, you know, the big bad comes up, grabs hold of the party's wizard, lifts them up in the air by their neck, and have them say something to the wizard in some cool, awesome, epic moment, because that also gives the wizard a chance to give a super awesome comeback to that moment, which makes them feel good. You know, so, you know, think back to some of the coolest movie fight scenes, right? You know, think back to some of the best fight scenes in a lot of these action movies. You know, a lot of the time, you know, they're not just sitting there shooting each other doing nothing. There's talking happening. You know, they're shouting at each other from across the room. You know, they're, you know, or to their buddies, or to a walkie-talkie, or, you know, a messaging device of some kind. You know, get good at trying to include in-combat talk from your enemies to your players as often as possible. This is also a really good way, by the way, to include, you know, to drop lore and to drop little pieces of things that maybe the party didn't have the opportunity to find out yet. You know, I think that can be a really cool way to, you know, try to get a little lore dumping in right before they kill the big bad, so that they realize that, oh shit, we weren't just killing some random fucking enemy token on a battle map. We were killing this entity that did these things and had these connections. All of those things. All right, number 5, I've said it once, I've said it twice. Get descriptive. Stop saying that, okay, my guy goes up, he hits you, he does 10 points of damage, move on. This is also how come, and again, I'm kind of jumping around here a little bit, but that's my style, right? This is how come I hate taking average damage. I know that is one of the best ways to speed up combat. I'm not dissuading that. But what I am saying is that, to me, nothing draws me out of a combat scenario more than when my DM just goes, hey, does a 22 hit? Yeah, okay, you take 6 points of damage. Hey, does an 18 hit? It does 6 points of damage. You know, like there's no, you know, like it feels like, okay, like now it feels like I'm playing a video game where it's like, okay, so his sword does 6 points of damage and that's it. So, okay, so now I can do the math. Okay, so I have 36 hit points, so I can get hit 6 times. Okay, so I can do the math. Like, I don't know. Like, I hate that vibe. I like when there's randomness. I like when sometimes the enemy hits me and it does 10 points of damage. Sometimes they hit me and it does 30 points of damage, and you just don't fucking know. You know, it makes it so every time the enemies, you know, every time the DM says, hey, does this hit? I'm like, shit, yeah, it does. All right, let's hear the damage. Let's hear it. Like then, you know, when you got that moment of pause, that quiet, how everyone gets a little quiet to just listen to the number, you know, all of that, you know. So get descriptive, try to come up with cool, interesting ways, and try to do them in a rather quick fashion. Don't sit there and choreograph every single footstep the enemy takes. But instead of grappling, describe how, the character, the big boss reaches out, grabs hold of your character. I need you to make a strength saving throw as he reaches into your chest piece and tries to literally bend the metal with his hand to keep you restrained, so that he can, so that he winds up his hammer to hit you harder next time. Just stuff like that. When the vines are coming, when an entangle spell is cast, describe how, what the entanglement would look like, and if there's some cases where a player's just like, okay, I just go up and I just try to like kind of bonk him with the butt of my knife, the butt of my dagger, then, okay, obviously, like, read from that emotion. So it's like, okay, yeah, you run up, you just kind of give him a nice good clonk on the back of the helmet, go ahead and roll. And that's it. You don't need to come up with super huge in-depth descriptions every time. But if we're talking about trying to make combats a little better, more epic, more engaged, then getting descriptive. Stop, instead of just saying, okay, you come up, you hit, go ahead, roll damage. Like, get better. Just get more descriptive than that, and I promise you will see a vast change. Number 6, and this is the big one, and this is the last one here that we'll really talk about. Find the things that you can cut out to make combat faster. I've talked about this with my how to deal with bigger party sizes. Cut out initiative. Like, I have an 8-man party, and I told everybody session 1, I said, okay guys, I want everybody to tell me, and I believe I did something like, I think I did like 10 plus their dexterity saving throw, I think. That way, if you were proficient in dexterity, then you got a bonus to your dex. And then they all gave me their numbers, and I put them in order of fastest to slowest. And from there, I now have what I call my spreadsheet, my initiative spreadsheet, that every time we go into a combat, if it's not something super epic, if it's not a boss fight, then as soon as I get that music going, as soon as I tell them that, yep, combat's initiated, as soon as I bring out that battle map, it's immediately, okay, hey, Belle, it's your turn. Because she's my rogue, and she's the one that is going at like 18 because she has like a +6 or +8 something in her dexterity. And so, okay, Belle, you go first. Doesn't matter that she was in the back of the pack. It doesn't matter that like she was kind of listening in, whatever. She had the fastest dexterity. She was able to, move the fastest. She gets to go first. And at first, my party members who had played D&D before were like, oh, I kind of like playing, with initiative a little bit. By the second session, they're like, oh yeah, no, like this is good. I like knowing that I'm after this person every time. I like knowing that, okay, I have a few turns, people are going to go before me, so I can kind of, plan accordingly. So cutting out initiative. I mean, initiative can literally take like 5 minutes, which may not seem like much, but if you have, say, 3 or 4 combats in a session, which I don't think is too crazy to think about, that's 20 minutes that you're saving yourself in a session that could last 4 hours. 20 minutes, that's, literally what, a 1/6 of your time, an 1/8 of your time, just right there by just cutting out initiative. If you need to take average damage, you can. I personally wouldn't. I don't think that average damage is good, and I've already said my reasons why. I think it makes it too boring, too calculated, too cold, too impersonal. I like knowing that, damage could be a little different every time. But if you are someone who's like, I'm trying to cut, my combats last 3 hours and they shouldn't, how do I cut time out? Take average damage. Try to include things where, you tell your party like, hey guys, I understand, maybe you guys just leveled up. So today I'm going to try to have a combat scenario, so that we can kind of, grease the wheels a little bit, make sure we all kind of know what our abilities are. But after today, I may be implementing a timer. And it's not, it's not to punish you guys. It's just, hey, if you don't know what you're doing, if you cannot tell me in 60 seconds what it is your character does in 60 seconds, I'm moving on to the next person in the initiative. I'll come back to you. All right, I'll do this, this person will go next, and then I'll come right back to you. But I don't want to sit here and wait for 3 or 4 minutes for you to just end up telling me that you cast Eldritch Blast. Like, we have better things to do, because here's what will happen is, as soon as you do it once, as soon as that player gets skipped once, and not necessarily skipped, as soon as that player gets told, hey, you're taking a little too long here, we're going to move, we're going to come back to you. As soon as you do that once, then I promise you, one, that player is going to do everything they can to make sure that they're never skipped again. But also, secondly, I think it kind of shows, you're setting the example, you're setting the tone, all right, for what the environment, for what your expectations as a DM are. And even though we're trying to have fun, and even though even though having, this game with our friends is meant to be a fun, enjoyable experience, you as a DM are just as much a player as they are. And I think sometimes we have this mindset that, whatever, we the DMs have to always suffer, because as long as the party is having the absolute best time of their lives, which means if they end up taking 20 minutes for their turn, then they just take 20 minutes for their turn. I don't think that that's fair. You, the DM, are just as much a player in this game as they are. So I don't think that it's wrong for you to have a standard, to have an expectation that, hey, I'm not trying to punish you, and I promise you, I'll never skip your turn entirely. But if I get to you and you have 60 seconds to just tell me, and it's not like I'm going to have a timer up, all right? I'll just kind of have it going in my head, right? I'll just be thinking. And if in about 40, 60 seconds, if you can't really tell me what you want to do, then I want you to keep thinking about it, but I'm going to move on to the next person. And I think that alone, having that expectation, because if you think about it, if you can make it so that a person has to do their turn in 60 seconds, then that means that every person, let's take a 5-man party, right? So if you have a 5-person party, and each person knows, they have the expectation that they have to say what they're doing in that 1 minute, then let's go ahead and let's say that, they take 45 seconds to make their decision, 30, 45 seconds to move the token, say what they're doing. You, the DM, have to make the saving throw. They have to make this attack roll. They roll damage. You roll your save, whatever. I bet you in total, each person will only end up taking maybe 2.5 minutes for their turn to, from start to completion, will only take anywhere between 1 to 2 minutes. Guaranteed. If they can move, if they know what they're doing and they can make their decision in 45, 60 seconds, and if you, the DM, are on your A game, you got your saving roll die ready to go, they start swinging, you make your save, whatever it is, I bet you each person can be done within 2 minutes. Which means that your 5-man party, every round, is now only going to take about 8 to 10 minutes for each round. Most combat scenarios only end up lasting maybe 3 to 4 rounds of combat on average. So congratulations, we have now made it just by simply including a time constraint. If nothing else, by just simply including a time constraint of just like, hey, you need to know what you're doing in 60 seconds. Then you have made a combat scenario go from what would probably have been an hour to an hour and a half to 30 minutes. On average. Now, of course, that means the same needs to be applied to you. You, the DM, better make damn sure that you know what your boss is doing, what the enemies are doing. But these, to me, I think, are the big ones. I think if you do these 6 things, having multiple stage combat, changing the battlefield, having multiple enemies, even if it's one big bad and a few of his little tiny minions that have some decent AC but 1 hit point, so that as soon as they get hit, they die, including in combat talk, getting descriptive, and trying to cut out what you can, whether it's initiative, whether it's some, table talk, and by that I simply mean, trying to make sure that the player is, hey, stop being distracted, stop talking to this person right now, it's your turn, You're holding up 6 other people. So you have 60 seconds. Tell me what it is you want to do. If you can't tell me in 60 seconds, then I want you to keep thinking about it, but we're moving on. Average damage. Again, I don't recommend it, but if that is something that, if you believe at your table, average damage is something that would help more than hurt, then absolutely implement it. Your table, your rules. But to me, these 6 things will make any combat 1,000 times better than what you got going on right now. But this is my 2 cents. Whatever the case, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will catch you next time.